please stick together. We're here with the goodwill of Melbourne Polytechnic, and they do require that we stick to the route that we say we're going to. And you can get lost here. It sounds silly, but I think you'll appreciate that when you go into it. And we have had people get lost. So. First question, of course, is why this place is called Aradale. Well, when it was originally opened, it was called the Ararat Lunatic Asylum. Then it was referred to as the Ararat Mental Hospital, and later on the Hospital for the Insane. Now, the people of Ararat used to think that was a bit of a stigma for the town. So in the 1950s, the Ararat city ran a competition to come up with a more appropriate name, and one lucky lady won the grand prize of 5 guineas for coming up with the name Aridale, and that's what it's been referred to as ever since. The first patients here arrived in 1867, and the bulk of the institution closed in 1993. So it was open for 126 years. When it first closed, it remained closed for many years. And this was a bit of a political hot potato in this area, because this place employed 200 to 300 people when it was operating, and suddenly it disappeared. And the effects on the town's economy were immense. And I suppose it was about 7 or 8 years before anything was done to change that. There were lots of people who came here and looked at the place with grand ideas about using it. But again, once you walk through it, you'll understand why they didn't, because the money required to get it up to a condition to use it is pretty substantial. But it was still this hot potato sitting up empty on the hill here. And when government changed in Victoria, I think it was just over 2001, all of a sudden we heard that it was being taken over by North Melbourne Institute of TAFE. And they had the grand idea, I thought it was a very good idea at the time, of using it as a tertiary training institution for people who would become winemakers. That's a good idea, because in Victoria everybody who's a winemaker generally gets trained in South Australia or New South Wales. And so they had visions of a residential college here, but unfortunately they never got enough takers to get that going. In the meantime, they did plant the whole place down to grapevines, and it now runs a commercial winery here, and they also produce olive oil. But unfortunately the dream of having a residential tertiary institution didn't come to fruition. So, but still, you do have a body now who has given money by the government to basically maintain the place and coordinate it. The next question is, why was this put here in Ararat? Well, in the 1840s, if you lived in Western Victoria and you were unfortunate enough to suffer some sort of psychiatric illness, the police would come around to your place, arrest you and lock you up, and more than likely take you to Yarra Bend in Melbourne, where you would be locked up. In the 1840s, if you tended to be violent as well, they would have put you on a ship and taken you to Gladesville in Sydney, where you would be locked up. So conceivably you could go from country Victoria to Sydney and possibly never see your family again. It's a very dramatic thing to happen. By the 1860s, people were no longer taken to Gladesville, but they were still taken to Yarra Bend in Melbourne. But the problem was the colony of Victoria was booming, and the population was growing, and Yarra Bend became overcrowded. So the Victorian government back then ran a commission to solve the overcrowding problem, and they came up with the idea of establishing 2 large country asylums, one here at Ararat and the other one at Beechworth. Now, why they chose Ararat and Beechworth out of all the other towns that were very keen to house big asylums like this, I don't know, but Ararat and Beechworth were the ones. In 1865, the first foundations were dug. And in 1867, the first patients arrived. Now, this is pretty dramatic, because basically the bulk of the buildings here, plus the surrounding walls, were built in 2 years. It's a pretty major achievement. 9 years later, in 1876, there were 400 patients here, even though the place was only designed for 304. By 1967, which was the centenary year here, there were 812 patients here, and at times there were over 1,000. So this was like a little village on the outskirts of Ararat. There were all sorts of tradesmen here. It was largely self-sufficient. When it first opened, the patients and staff were annoyed because on a Sunday the people of Ararat would come up here, climb up on the wall to watch the patients inside. And on one Sunday the conditions were so bad that the superintendent here at the time, Dr. Robertson, rang the police to get them to come and create order. But at the same time he was very keen to bring people in on guided tours with him because he wanted to dispel all the myths that existed around places like this. Aradale was much more economic to run than other institutions of its type because it's sitting here on a farm of 600 acres in the old terms, and it was largely self-sufficient. They produced a lot of their own food. When it first opened, it had its own dairy farm, and in 1967, its dairy farm here had 52 milking cows, which in those days would have been one of the biggest dairy farms in Victoria. They had a large fruit and vegetable garden. You would have passed the vegetable garden as you came up the road there. They had a piggery, 130 pigs here, 130 sows here in 1967. Again, one of the biggest piggeries in Victoria at the time. And in the early years, they ironically had a flourishing vineyard and winery here. They even had underground cellars here, like out at Seppel. Unfortunately, it caved in. But that only lasted till the 1890s, when one of the superintendents thought that that was an inappropriate thing for a place like this to do. So it's ironic that after all that time it's back to being a winery again. Now what we'll do is we'll just walk around and we'll stop at points of interest, have a chat along the way, ask any questions you like, have a chat to Steve or I, and to one another. Sure, it'll be a good social tour these, so let's go. It's in 29, and it was set up as a nurses' home. Back in the 1890s, the Ararat Mental Hospital, as it was then, trained psychiatric nurses, which was pretty innovative for its time. And in later years, Aradale here would have trained most of the psych nurses in Victoria. And when I came to Ararat, I was a teacher at the local secondary school. I was surprised to find that there was no stigma at all about working in mental health in Ararat, because Year 10 boys aspired to be psych nurses because their fathers and their grandfathers had been psych nurses. So it did a lot of good for some of those fellows. But anyway, when you had people coming from all over Western Victoria, and remember these kids when they came here might have only been 16 or 17 years old when they came to start their training. We'd be pretty worried about them coming to a town like Ararat and living without some sort of supervision. So this worked like a traditional nurses' home. There would have been a matron in there who made sure everyone was home in bed at the appropriate time. Except I did take a lady on tour recently who had done her nursing training here, and she confessed that her boyfriend from Ararat used to get into the nurses' home through the woodbox, which amused her present husband no end. Anyway, by the 1970s though, it wasn't very cool for kids to come and live here under supervision. They prefer to live in Ararat, so the demand for rooms here dropped, and then they took apprentices from who would have been working here on other parts of the site, and they were allowed to live here as well. So we will go into there later. We'll come around the other side. Put your arm through there. The inside surface of this is completely flat. But just the same, if you did manage to get up to the top of the wall somehow, you can see that the wall is arched inwards to further discourage you getting over the top. So it looks fairly secure. A friend of mine was a nurse here at one stage, and he said that one day he and one of his mates were standing in the yard, and one said to the other, "Who's that on the roof?" And they looked up, and it was one of the patients. People in here had a long time to think about getting out. Some of them were very good at it. The fact that this whole area was a hospital, people, of course, with mental illness, though, can be physically ill as well. And so if they were physically ill and it wasn't too severe, they would be treated on site. So this hospital housed about 30 women. The men's hospital is over on the other hill there. It's in much worse condition than this one. I think you'll find it's pretty remarkably intact. In later years, a lot of the women in here would have been basically geriatric patients, so it would have been just geriatric care. But when you come in, it is a magnificent looking place. Now, one thing in here, there's one working toilet on the tour route. It's in here. If you want to go, go now. It'll be at the end of the corridor on your right. There's a magnificent entry here. Lovely high ceilings, all done up. Now this, of course, was a high security ward. And the first time I came in, I said to my guide, well, it can't be too high security, why don't they break the windows? But they're covered in that very thick perspex there. Now, this ward here, as I said, was where the patients who were finishing off their time here would be held. There's about 7 of them here at a time. Pardon me. This ward is also, well, this part of it is also notorious because those of you who went on the J ward tour this morning would have heard of a fellow called Gary Webb or Gary David, who was adjudged by the government of Victoria to be so dangerous that he had to be locked up for the rest of his life. And that place where he was going to be locked up for the rest of his life was here. They spent some $80,000 modifying 3 rooms here specifically for him, so he could be kept locked up there. But ironically, he never spent a single night here. But you're going to see the Gary Webb suite now. Just wander through those 3 rooms there. You'll see how his life was empty. Just wander through these 3 rooms here, you'll see where he was meant to spend the rest of his life. These 3 rooms here would have been his life. Now he was given an ensuite with his own shower, which none of the other patients got.
Compared to J ward, it's going to look pretty easy.
Compared to J ward, it is much more luxurious, isn't it? Yeah. So I just pointed out to those who just came in, he had his own ensuite, which was a little different than the others. The others only ever had a toilet in their cells, not a...
Would you able to go outside?
Yeah, I imagine they let it. The thing was, he never lived here. He never spent a single night here. So I don't know what the theory would have been, whether he was allowed out. I imagine he would have been treated like all the others. But, well, it is much more comfortable than Jay would have been. You see at the back of the nurses' station is a map on the wall, a map of this complex. This was the nurses' alarm. If someone got in trouble, they hit the alarm and a light would flash on the board there so that the other nurses could see what the problem was. Not long after this place closed here, one of the nurses, a female nurse, was attacked by a patient and locked in a cupboard. Her male partner tried to come to her aid and he was getting a fairly severe beating before he managed to hit an alarm button and the other nurses could come in and save the day.
So what year was this one?
This was built in 1993, after 1993. On your right here, this lounge area would have been available for patients to watch television or otherwise relax. Aradale. Back in the 1960s, apparently an ambulance delivered a patient here one night, and the rumour has it that the ambulance driver fancied one of the nurses a bit, so he stopped around for a chat. And in doing so, in those days, they had to let the ambulance idle so that the batteries didn't go flat for the radio. So his ambulance was idling outside until another patient wandered past and saw the ambulance there, hopped in and drove away. He made his way up past where the jail is now. He couldn't really drive because he rolled it in the ditch out there. And in those days the jail was a low security jail. They had work parties outside the walls, and a group of prisoners raced up, tipped the ambulance back on its wheels, brushed the guy down. "You right, mate?" "Yep," and he drove off. He arrived back for tea apparently, but the ambulance driver was in a bit of trouble. There's another story here about a lady. Her first day of work after school when she was just a teenage girl was here in the women's hospital. Came up here, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, really keen to help, and the matron said, look, we did collect the ladies' dentures and clean them, so she got a big tray, took all the dentures away and cleaned them and came back and then realised she didn't know which dentures went with which lady. So she spent a large time trying to find the appropriate dentures in the right mouth. And she was so mortified by that she went home that night, packed her clothes, got on the train and left Aradale. She was going to leave for good, couldn't face it. The father found where she was, brought her back here to work, and she spent the rest of her life working here. But we say that was indentured labour. Pool here we think was built in the 1970s, because at the time they had a group of patients, young patients here, teenage psych patients. And we think they were built, the pool was built for their recreation. But of course most patients here would not be allowed in a pool without one-on-one supervision in a place like this. So that's why it's nice material. They repaired 29,000 items of clothing. They altered 650 items of clothing and they manufactured 7,500 items of clothing. So it would have been a pretty busy little place in there. But now we can see the grandeur of this building. We get close enough to see it. And this was the women's wards here. So divided into several sections according again to the degree of disability of the patients. We're going to go in and see one in a moment. In front of us here we have these fenced off areas. Now as I said, by the 1970s this was an open institution and patients who were capable of it could leave every day and come back in at night. And look, there were a whole group of patients who were regularly in the town. Everybody knew them by name because you'd see them all the time. There used to be one fellow I used to play football with a local team here, and there was one fellow who always used to be in our club rooms when we were getting ready for a game, and he always was wearing our jumper, which we appreciated. But one day I went to watch another team play in town, and there he was in their dressing rooms, and he had their jumper on. And when you look very closely, he actually had everyone's jumper on, just which one was on top. Anyway, but see, some of the patients, if they were released from here and wandered off, would get lost or might get knocked down in traffic because they didn't have skills. So some of them, when they were allowed out, would have still been fenced in by these sort of fences like this. This octagonal building in front of us here was a sheltered workshop called the Vatmy building. So in the early days, before they had access to the pension, patients were able to do small repetitive tasks and get paid a little bit of pocket money. So that would have been important for them then. Through the gap in the trees there, underneath there, you can see a building which is now labelled the cleaning store, but it was originally called the fever tent because it was the isolation ward for people with infectious diseases. In the 1800s here, there were 2 typhoid epidemics, one of which killed several patients and a nurse. So, you know, in a place like this where you've got lots of people, poor sanitary conditions when people would throw stuff out on the ceiling and then it would get onto the roof and it would get into the rainwater which was collected in your drinking tanks, you know, the risk of epidemics was very high. And you can imagine what would happen with something like TB in a place like this in those days. It would be devastating. So that would have been the isolation ward. Now I want you to come down through here, and this is one of the great sights of Aradale.
I was just going to say, can we take a picture of this?
This was, by the way, I don't stand in the centre there. If you look up there, there's a large piece of wood, and if you look around it, there's a lot of rotting wood holding it in place. One day that's going to come down. But you can see a possum up there. It's squeezed in the gap there. Usually possums in there. This sunshade was built in 1879 and modified in 1892. I think it originally had shingles on it, and then they later put the sheet iron over the top of the shingles as they started to be damaged. But isn't it just fantastic? The guy who designed this was a genius. And there used to be another one of these over in the male side, but that collapsed, unfortunately. The reason for these big sunshades, and there were 7 or 8 of them around the complex, was that in the early days, one of the early drugs they gave patients to deal with their mental illness reacted badly with sunshine. So if they went out in the direct sun, they would get a really damaging in condition. So these big sunshades allowed them to be outside in the fresh air but not get exposed to sun. So we're going to head back into the main building and have a look in one of the women's wards.
And then what's the stairs? And then not a stairs.
Showers and toilets at the end of the corridor. Except for these who are en suite. Sorry? There were double rooms.
Could I start four?
There were couples of married couples who would be communal kitchen and this marvellous.
It just missed it out a little bit.
Yes, very much so. Yes. I love these beautiful fireplaces here. And of course, the people 2 stories up from us had a lounge room just like this, and they would have had a magnificent view out over the town from up here. So, the best real estate in Aradale is occupied by a jail and a mental hospital. Broken glass. How do you get possums and possum manure and leaves and dirt? It was filthy because nothing had been done for about 20 years. So there you go.
Wow.
Now, the thing is though, that this is only as nice as this because it hasn't rained heavily recently. If we had a large storm tonight, we'd come here tomorrow and there would be a small lake of brown water on the floor there. Because the roofs are slate, they're held on by wires. They've been over here for over 100 years. The wires break, the wind will move them, and then the possums get in. And there'll be tons of possums living in this roof here. They love it here. And there'll be possum manure about that thick on the ceiling, probably. But it looks good when it's all restored. It would be very good. Some women, of course, who might have been a bit difficult to control would have been living in single wards like this where they had panels that could be locked across the window so they couldn't be broken. Of course, in places like this, fire was a great fear, particularly when you have hundreds of people living in dormitory accommodation, many of whom would struggle to get out in daylight, let alone a fire at night with smoke everywhere. And there have been some tragedies in Victoria in mental hospitals. I think it was Kew Cottages in the early 2000s. There was a fire there and several patients died. So luckily here there were never any fires of any consequence in the wards. There would be hundreds of false alarms here every year, answered by the local fire brigade. But in the early 1970s, the superintendent's house was burnt down here when someone left a tray full of oil on the stove. It was a nice heritage building too. Here was the linen store. Now you can imagine with that many patients in a place like this, there were a lot of blankets and sheets to be washed. Originally, and clothing of course. Originally there was a laundry on site, but of course that became uneconomic when they got big laundries in the big cities. So Later on, they used to send all the patients' clothes and and linen off to Ballarat to be washed. That was okay when the patients didn't have individual clothing, but in the 1970s, patients were given access to the pension, which would have revolutionised their lives because they were finally able to borrow or to buy small personal comfort items. And so, like everybody, they wanted to buy their own clothes. But the problem was when you sent away all those clothes in a big consignment of laundry, a lot of the patients didn't get their own clothes back. And so they solved that problem by putting small laundries in each of the wards so that they could wash individual clothing there. The building at the end there, that small one, was what they called the kiosk. And again, this was really important when patients got access to their own money, because apparently the women just wanted to buy their own soap. The soap that was given out by the government wasn't very nice. And of course they could also buy luxuries like cigarettes and lollies and things like that as well. The kiosk was run by a group of volunteers from Ararat called the Ararat Auxiliary, who used to come up here. They'd run the kiosk. They also used to run activities in the wards for the patients. And I think they're a very noble group of people. We can now see for the first time one of the towers in its glory. So you've got a 5-storey tower there. Why? In fact, you've got 2 5-storey towers. There's another one over the other side. So why do we build a 5-storey tower? The answer is hidden behind the second floor down from the top, where there's a single window in the middle of the wall there. Behind that window there are several large water tanks. So they would pump water up to that level so that they could then get gravity feed pressure out throughout the rest of the complex. The level above that, with the 3 windows and all the colonnades there, the only thing in there is a ladder to get you from the second top layer to the roof. So it's entirely and utterly decorative. Now at the back here, we'll have a look at this building in the centre, starting from the back. The top story there was the staff dining hall. That was divided in half because the male staff had to eat separately from the female staff. And I can still remember when I first started teaching in the 1970s, some schools still had separate male and female staff rooms. Don't know what they thought would happen, but anyway. Underneath that, there are 2 layers of rooms there which are storerooms. So everything that was delivered to here was delivered to the back of that building, put into storage, then taken outside out to each of the wards as required. The lower building in the centre here was the kitchen. Now this was a kitchen for over 1,000 people at one stage. You can imagine how much industry was going on in there. So what they would do was cook the meals. In later years they'd put them onto electric trolleys, which they would wheel out to a room like the women's ward number 2. We were there in the kitchenette. They would wheel it out there, plug it into the wall to keep the food hot, and then serve it out as required. The central area here has the label on it, main dining hall. Well, for most of its time it wasn't a main dining hall. Originally it was where the church services were held. But it was also a grand hall where patients could be taken for group activities like dances, parties. Bingo was very popular, and but it was in the 1970s. The psychiatrist at the time, Dr. Blair Curry, was worried that women who lived in a room like women's ward number 2 or number 3 might be here all their lives, but never really meet anybody else except the ones who lived in women's ward number 2 and number 3. So he was really keen to encourage patients, if they were capable of it, to come out of the wards and go to a central dining hall. So we're going to go into the kitchen. Now the tower, which is just a copy of the one we'd already seen. These rooms at the end here were offices for doctors who provided GP services for patients. But again, the problem was here that it was difficult to get doctors to provide GP services to come and live in Ararat. And also this building here housed a room which was a hairdresser, a women's hairdresser. So the women in the wards here could have come in and got their hair done on site, which would have been probably quite pleasing for them. Up here you've got that magnificent view out over the And this room here was where the big boss of the whole place had his office. With his magnificent 1970s curtains. It's been quite cosy up here. Okay, we're now going to head across to the Now this is one of the gallery areas, and this is a magnificent space. And over in the male wards, upstairs, there are galleries which would be twice as big as this. They're amazing. And unfortunately we can't take you to see them, but there are just some magnificent structures around in these buildings. So this, the ladies in this wing, of course, would have been a bit less dependent than the ones before, and so the rooms they've got are much larger. So we're just going over an archway here where the double iron gates are, like we've been through this. And again, you've got this Now, isn't this spectacular?
Yeah.
This was built in 1867 for 314 site patients. The city of Aradale had to wait another 30 years before they got a hall this big. So, it's amazing, isn't it? When this complex was first built and they opened it up, they held a grand ball here for all the people of Aradale. Now, when it was first set up, this area here was used for church services. But of course, you can see how good it would be for parties, for activities, bingo, as I said, watching films for the patients. And it's been spoiled a bit actually by the way this dining area in, but I guess you can't have everything. And when we walk up here, just enjoy this nice lush carpet from the 1970s. With hardly any use. The dormitory area like we saw before, and you can see that the partitions like we saw in the other room have been taken out here. This whole section here was actually built on later when it became overcrowded, so they built another wing on. But I just bring you here to show you again what happens to buildings like this when water gets in. You can see it contrasts in the ceiling falls in, then the floor starts to rot. And it also shows you what happens when idiot vandals get into a place like this, take that fire hose, turn it on, and leave it here for about 3 days before anyone finds it. And so, thankfully, the vandalism is less here now than it was, but you still get idiots. So this was where these guys would have been probably the most able and capable of the fellows. So they had much bigger bedrooms, as you see. They probably would have been able to have a lot more personal items than some of the others we saw. So, you can judge generally by the more capable the patients, the more carpet there was. The less capable, the more lino there was.
Was the carpeting the equivalent of the ladies, or was it all
Yes. Yes, but we didn't go into the ones with for the better ladies. That was right up the front end, Butchery and Butchery. So this magnificent building was used as a chapel in later years. In the early days it was built as a fire pump station, or a fire pump house. And the reason for that was, of course, in the early days if a fire started, you didn't have enough water pressure to fight it. So if a fire started, they would start up the pumps to generate the pressure. But of course, once reticulated water, and that became common in the 1960s, they closed the fire pump station down and then converted this to a chapel. We'll show you where the original chapel was later. The Catholics and Anglicans had their services on a Sunday, and the Presbyterians used to have to come in on Wednesdays. So in later years, of course, this would have been used for funerals, because as the demographic changed here and the patients got older and older, because no young patients coming in, they were gradually dying off, literally. And most patients here who died here were probably buried out in the normal cemetery with everyone else, but of course patients with relatives could take them away if you're buried with their family somewhere else. But it is quite a nice building, isn't it?
Until recently, the prayer was mentioned on this place. Water used the word and all that.
So this large dormitory area here probably had about 25 men in it, and what it was, you'd have about 2 beds here as you head onto each of these partitions. Then there would have been wardrobes on either side of the beds for the fellows to keep their stuff in. So when you would have come in here, then you would have had a sort of a forest of wardrobes in here, with all the beds between them. But these guys were in the messages now, nice and light. Yeah, so generally, in any institution, you people who work there in the other conversions.
You did get a good view of Aridale.
Generally, I think most people here right there, right from here. It doesn't matter what the institution is, someone will use. So if you'll come around this side, let's point out on this side here was the butchery area, and there were 2 or 3 walk-in refrigerators in the walls there where the meat would have been stored, then chopped up as required out here. And then we get into this area here.
We're going to go in there and you can see.
Now, most when the place goes down, they basically cleared everything out that they could carry. And they stacked them down in the paddock down the back there, and they had an auction which went for 3 days. And a lot of stuff, you could have got some bargains there, I can assure you. But thankfully, when they came in here, they didn't take quite everything. And I'm amazed why they didn't. But that big roasting machine there, apparently they can do 100 cooks at a time in there. And they left these magnificent things here.
No, you know what
This
about
apparently
it?
was, I think it was
You know what
coffee and soup permanently in these 2 big containers. These things here were where you could cook a huge amount of bulk food at once. So imagine you're wanting to make, say, boiled vegetables for your roast. So you put them in there, fill it up with water. The steam, which was piped everywhere through here, you can see some steam pipes behind us there. There's a steam envelope around the bottom here, which would heat everything inside. And when your meal was cooked, you put the lid up, a strainer over the top, and then empty the water. So that's rather neat. You just go down the drain. Now these things apparently are worth tens of thousands of dollars. And for some reason they do. Now, I just brought you in here just to point out that this section of the room I said was made up of lots and lots of storage rooms. And you can get some idea of them here just looking around you now. There are storage areas everywhere. And there was another level down the bottom. I can't take you there, there's no light there at the moment. So anyway, everything was brought in, stored here, then taken off out the other walls. So we'll go back. Aradale looking in. We'd just driven up the drive here. This was the grand entrance to Aridale. And the beauty is now we can see the wall as it was. Beautiful condition. And remember I said this wall was to keep people in originally. Now when you look at the wall here, it's not very high, so you'd think, how does it keep anyone in? I want you to go over there and climb up and look over the wall and see what the patients saw from the inside.
That doesn't mean climb up that you fall off, Kenzie.
Yeah, hang on to them, please.
I'm not going to climb up. Mackenzie falls. You don't have to tell your son that.
Yeah, that's...
This was called Ha-Ha Wall. Now, I used to think it was ha-ha, you couldn't get out, but that's not the reason at all. Right, I brought you down here for the view. Not bad, is it?
pretty good.
But I want you to see this view out this way too, because it is just as good. Unfortunately, these saplings have got leaves on them at the moment, but if you look through the saplings, you've got that nice mountain view out the back there. That's called Mount Langi Charan, which means in the local Aboriginal dialect, the pregnant lady. So the highest bit is her belly, then onto the right her shoulders, the dip for her neck, and then her chin and forehead. So now I want you to, if you come around to a gap here in the trees, you'll see some white roofs out through there, just below the tree line. That's today's modern jail in Ararat, just doubled in size at stupendous cost. And the builders went broke halfway through the renovation, and a lot of it had to be pulled down and rebuilt. So.
There's a fountain that used to be behind you on a good westerly day.
Yeah.
Play this way and watch the front of the building come.
Oh,
Because it used to work the fountain. Little vandals and that got hold of it and started playing funny ones.
amazing big buildings.
Okay?
Amazing big buildings.
Yes, well, this is another original. You're in here. See, yeah, in there there's a safe. An old safe. Yeah.
I bring you in here especially to show you the Aradale safe. The Aradale safe was important because they stored the Aradale silver here. And also, of course, when it first started, you had a big workforce who were all paid with cash money on one day. And that would have been very attractive for some very dishonest people. So, of course, you have a nice big safe like this to store it. So, it's a bit wonky now, the door's a bit hard to close. The other thing we can see here is one of the strange aspects of closing down a building, and see what happens to the paintwork when there's no heating. And we like to say that this paintwork is crazed. You just go out the door and turn right and then immediately left, you'll come with a series of photos.
That's up there with your indentured lady.
Yes, it is. I get all these jokes from tourists actually. Photographs. Many of this building when it was really kept in much better condition than now. You can see this early one here, which I think from the date is 1896, when all of the front was really had detailed work in the paint. All the arches were highlighted, and none of the plants had grown then. Over here at the side, we've got a couple of historic photos. This one here showing we met at the start of the tour right there, and this is showing. This was taken when the wall was just being built. And down below it, you have this picture here of racks and racks of the 3 million bricks that they made on site here. down where the vegetable garden is now. And those bricks are all out there drying, presumably. This building here was the gatehouse, right? It was until it closed, then they didn't even bother to rent it out, and it's been vandalised, which is a great waste. I had two very elderly people one day on tour, and they were, I think, in their 80s, and they were saying that, the man was saying that his father had lived in, he was the superintendent here at one stage, way back during the Second World War, and his father here was living in the gatehouse there, and at that stage he said they played tennis on the tennis courts there, which no longer exist. Now, we're now in a position again where we can see the walls in their original condition. So standing here, it doesn't look that high, but of course if you went down where the palm trees are, you'd find that you've got a 5-metre high wall. The other thing is you've got one of the lateral walls still standing here, which divided the airing courts into different sections. And this is the only one of the lateral walls still left. All the others have been knocked down. Now, just point out that separate section there, that was male ward number 6. Now, male ward number 6 was where the most disabled patients were kept. And now these were people who really had trouble doing anything for themselves, like feeding themselves, washing themselves, or toileting themselves. So that would have been a very, very sad place. Now, looking back down near the wall there, if you look through the gap in the trees, just near the intersection there, behind that is the original vegetable garden for Aradale, and that's all been planted down now to lavender, so they make lavender oil here as well. Looking down through between the palm trees here, there's a 9-hole golf course down there called the Aradale Golf Course. It's a public course, anyone can use it. A friend of mine, when she first came to Ararat here in the 1970s, went for her first round of golf here, and she was surprised when a naked man came out of a water hole carrying 2 handfuls of golf balls, which he wanted to sell to her. At one stage, I don't know whether she did or not. At one stage here, the staff here set up a kite, and they would fly it from a big reel here, and it would go as far down as the highway. So the staff and the patients would enjoy that. So anyway, coming back along here, I'd like to point out along the base of the wall. Just go around this section of the wall here, looking at this row of bricks and looking at all the stuff that's been carved into the brickwork over time. There are hundreds and hundreds of carvings on the walls around here. So again, there are a lot of them at the base of that wall down there. Now we're going to head down to the morgue.
Final resting place. By saying this, try before you bite, because next time you're on it, you might not know it.
Now again we get a good view of the wall. So bluestone down to bedrock, then the bricks and then that bluestone capping on top. And it's in magnificent condition after all this time. Now as we walk up along this road here, on either side there's a row of buildings which were workshops for the various tradesmen on site here. There were all sorts of tradesmen here. It was like a village again. You had a bootmaker, you had the carpenters, you had the glaziers, you had the painters, the upholsterers, all trained here. When I was teaching here, in the early days they'd take about a dozen kids a year for apprenticeships up here. So they would get a trade. And if there were enough jobs here, they would perhaps stay here working on. If there weren't, they went out into industry outside. So one of the things we forget about places like this, when they're sold off or closed down, there are hidden costs. You know, this used to be responsible for training a lot of tradesmen in country towns. So when you sell it, it all goes.
But you're saying about the sewing room?
Yes.
They sell those articles
No,
outside?
not that I know of, no. No, this was just for use here. Yeah. It must have run very, very well when it first started. And when we get round to the finish, we'll come into our rooms there, and you'll see some of the photos taken in about 1900 of this place, and it was immaculate. You know, everything was so neat and so orderly. And it's just sad now that when you see it like this,
Hi, Mackenzie.
5-metre high wall around it to stop people getting out, and that was all the patients. By the 1970s, it was relatively open here. Most patients, or a lot of patients, could get out in the morning. They'd go down to town, they'd come back at night for type of tea. But when it first started, they were all locked in. Now, this wall doesn't look like it would lock anyone in at the moment, but that's because someone has filled up the other side of it there with a large amount of soil. When we get round the other side, and we see the wall in its original condition, you'll understand how effective it was at keeping people in. So this wall originally would have gone from here right down to where Steve is, and around to the left, and right down to where we started here. So parts of the wall have been torn down in various places. When you get around the other side, there's a large section of it which is still in its original condition.
So this is one of the old buildings they've actually restored a bit.
Yeah.
Some photos of.
Now, out the back here, there's a little section we're still renovating. It's still much better than it was.
Sorry.
So you can get, you know, a pretty good result out of a building that was really looking pretty shocking.
It's good to see.
It is, yeah, it is. And it didn't take that much money actually. Yeah, that's it, the real thing is to fix the roof.
Sorry.
Yeah, people realise that get rid of the blossom, and then you can do something with it. Yeah? Oh, sorry, come through. This, I say that bit's been restored. This bit's in the process. Oh, okay.
I'm not here.
You're not here.
I'm not here. Sitting on chair. Look.
it's raining and you're all waiting outside for the tour to start, it used to be very unpleasant. Did you see him? No. See how well that's come up? Yes.
Well, two tidbits. Oh, it's not like
Thank you.
welcome.
Excellent.
Hey?
that's
Jay was
great.
another fascinating story.
Okay, Grace? 21 now. Are they all $10?
Welcome. You're lucky no one didn't want to leave you here. Especially knowing the place was better. Hey? Sorry.
What are you doing?
Without the TV, video games, you wouldn't have been just like sitting in the room.